morning, guys. So back in the summer of 1995, I was a junior about to become a senior in high school, and I got jumped. I got jumped at a park in Albuquerque, Snow Park, if you know where that is. It's Eubank and Indian School. And just to preface this, I was a mouthy little guy. So I had a tendency to mouth off to just about everybody I saw. And there was a guy there that was playing basketball that I had mouthed off to before, and we'd jawed back and forth, and I didn't think much of it. But that night, my brother and one of my close friends and I were at this park. We were playing basketball. We were about to play basketball, and these three guys came up. One of them was one of those guys, and we were going to play some 3-on-3, and I was not thinking much of it. I was just getting ready to play some basketball. But before I knew it, I turned, and I saw this ball just smash me right in the nose. And the ball hit me in the nose. And so when you get hit in the nose with a basketball, you tear up, you kind of go blind for a second. And before I knew it, I got three guys just punching me in the face. And I didn't know what was happening. My brother and my friend decided it was safer to just run to the car. So they took off to the car. I'm throwing my brother under the bus. He might be listening to this sermon this morning. Thanks, Justin, for running away. Anyway, but in any case, he ran to the car. I kind of figured out what was going on, and I ran to the car too, and I hopped in the car. And my memory of this is pretty vivid. I hopped in the car, and we had a baseball bat in the car. We put it in the window. Another guy took a knife out of his pocket, and he stabbed the tire. And we sat there for a second like, what are we supposed to do? Right? It was crazy. You didn't expect this to happen. You're like, what are we supposed to do now? And I got to thinking about it. I knew a guy from church, an adult from the church that lived down a road not far from there. And I thought to myself, I don't know that I can beat the knife, but I know I can outrun these guys, so I'll just run to this guy's house. And I did. I got out and I sprinted to the guy's house. We called the police and ended up going back and fixing the tire. It was a crazy situation. It was wild because I did not anticipate this. I wasn't expecting it, and it happened before I knew it. Many of us go through experiences of life exactly like that, right? Where we're not looking for it, we're not expecting confrontation, we're not expecting things to get crazy, and then they do. But sometimes the expectations are built on past experiences. Today we're going to look at a story that actually has a little bit of a feel to the story I just told. We're going to be looking at a story in Genesis chapter 32. And in this story, we're going to talk about a guy named Jacob. Last week, Brandon talked about Jacob's dad, Isaac. And Isaac was Abraham's son. Isaac was the man that God had said is going to be the son of Abraham, that is going to, through which the promise is going to be kept, that the sands of the seashore weren't going to be able to number the progeny, the children of Abraham. Well, we pick up today with Isaac's son, Jacob. And in this story, I want to preface this as you guys turn to Genesis 32 with what happened between where Brandon was and where we are today. And Jacob was born with a brother. He and his brother Esau were twins. Isaac had two sons. They were twin brothers. One of them was older. Esau was older. Jacob was younger. This was kind of a dysfunctional family. Esau was a manly man. They say he was like super, by the time he was an adult, he was like hairy and strong, and he was a hunter, and he would go out and he'd kill stuff, and he was doing all these things. And Jacob wasn't. Jacob was a little less so. So some of you guys can relate with Esau. You're like, I want to be that guy, right? And some of you guys can relate with Jacob. Like, I'm not as comfortable in that situation. Jacob actually, because this family was dysfunctional in some ways, Jacob was more loved by his mom than Esau was, and Esau was more loved by his dad than Jacob was. Some of us may come from a family like that where one sibling was more loved than another. This was literally what was said. It was said about this, and this was a rough deal. Into this family dynamic, Jacob was born, and Jacob was always fighting for himself, always trying to gain a little bit more for himself as the younger brother. One day, Jacob actually was able to convince his big brother to sell his birthright to Jacob over a cup of stew because he was so hungry. Another time, Jacob snuck in, because his mom told him to do it, snuck into Dad. Dad, by this time, was blind. And through a set of circumstances, convinced Dad to give the firstborn blessing to the son, Jacob. Now, that stuff may not mean a lot to us, but it sure meant a lot to Jacob and Esau. After this situation, Esau decided, as soon as my dad dies, I'm killing my brother. It's going to be it. I'm done. I can't deal with this guy anymore. I can't handle him anymore. The next time I see him after dad dies, it's over. Jacob hears about this. Actually, Jacob's mom hears about this, and she says, you need to leave. So he leaves. He goes to his uncle's house, his mom's brother, travels away, and spends the next 20 years trying to build up for himself a family and an estate. He ends up having a lot of kids, 12 kids, 13 actually. He has a bunch of kids. He has a lot of livestock, a lot of different things. He's able to accomplish a lot of different things. But into this story, what we're going to look at today is something that is really, really important for us. While he was traveling, Jacob had been promised by God that God was going to bless him. But when things got hard for Jacob, he ended up in the scariest of situations. So we're going to pick up right here. We're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 32. Jacob is now traveling back home, back to where he was from, and he sent a message to his brother saying, I'm coming back. He sends this so that maybe his brother will be prepared. And the next word Jacob gets from his servants is, hey, we just went out into the desert. We saw your brother coming, and he's coming with 400 guys, an army of 400 guys. So Jacob now is scared. He realizes that his brother, the last time he talked to him, said he was going to kill him, and now he's coming with 400 guys. This is it. This is the moment we pick up on. Genesis chapter 32, starting in verse 23, or verse 22. During the night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 servants' wives, and his 11 sons, and they crossed the Jabbok River with them. After taking them to the other side, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob does this. Just a little bit more of a catch-up for you here. Jacob splits all of his livestock into 2 groups, and he starts sending them towards his brother, hoping that maybe his brother will accept them as a bribe so he doesn't kill him. And then after he does that, he sends his entire family over to the other side of a ravine so that he can be by himself, and if his brother shows up, his brother will just meet him and not the kids, because he knows his brother will kill the kids too. That's where we're at. And in this picture, in this moment, Jacob finds himself alone and scared for his life. Now, I have a question for you. If you know the history, let me read this to you real quick here, just so we can catch you up on this. 20 years earlier, Jacob had been traveling to his uncle's house, and he ran into this. He had this vision. At the top of a stairway stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham, the God of your father Isaac. The ground you're lying on belongs to you. I'm giving it to you and your descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. They will spread out in all directions, to the east, the west, the north, and the south, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you and your descendants. What more, I am with you, and I will protect you wherever you go. One day I will bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you until you've finished giving you everything that I have promised you. So 20 years earlier, God had, in a vision, appeared to Jacob and said, I'm going to give you everything that I promised you. I'm going to give you this land. Your descendants are going to be so great. They're going to spread out everywhere. I'm going to protect you, and everything is going to be okay until I've done everything that I promised you. In this night, Jacob has decided to separate himself out from his kids, separate himself from his livestock. Why would he do that if God has promised to protect him? Why would Jacob be afraid if God has promised to protect him? Because that's the human nature. Let's be honest for a second. If you're a follower of God in this room, how many of you know intellectually that God promises that He's going to take care of you? Like, we're invincible until God chooses to take us home. Like, we know as followers that God is going to protect us until it's time for us to go with Him, to be with Him in heaven, and God's got this whole thing taken care of. How many of you know that intellectually? How many of you still find yourself all the time afraid over stuff that you can't control, even though God said He's going to take care of that stuff? The reality is that, right? I look at Jacob and I see myself in this window. Jacob knew what God had promised him. God had given him a vision. I'm going to do this. But when the hard time came, the really hard time came, his first response was fear. This is a really big deal. This is really important for us. Because once we start to be afraid, we can rationalize away the worst possible outcomes for any situation. Right? Jacob hears that his brother is coming with 400 guys, and in his mind, he knows the only reason he would be coming is he's coming to kill me. And so he does everything he can to separate himself from the things that he cares about so that they don't have to suffer too. We desire to be faithful. I think many of us in this room desire to be faithful. We want to have faith in God. The primary thing that kills our faith isn't doubt. We often hear that doubt is the opposite of faith. Fear is actually the opposite of faith. When you find yourself afraid, you will rationalize away why it is that God, who has promised to be with you and has walked with you before, is not walking with you right now. When fear builds in, faith is gone. With that, the story gets weird. All right, you guys ready for the weird part of the story? Let's go. This is the wild part. I've always found this part fascinating. It's pretty crazy. So, starting in verse 24, he's separated, he's by himself, he's alone. This left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until dawn began to break. When the man saw that he couldn't win the match, he touched Jacob's hip, and it wrenched it out of socket. Then the man said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." All right. This is crazy to me. I don't understand what's going on here. I don't understand why this happens. This is like the name of all it is Alabama is happening right now. They're sitting here and Jacob is by himself in the dark, alone in this deserted desert land. And while he's sitting there, this guy comes up and they just start wrestling. Weird. Right? Little weird. But I want to talk to you about what God does in this moment. I think this is powerful. Jacob is in the scariest loneliness moment of his entire life. Right? He is left alone. He is out here. He has done everything that he can to try to protect his family. And he finds himself alone on what is bound to be the longest night of his entire life. And while he's out there on this long night, some man comes up and it's like angels. Some man comes up and they just start wrestling together, and it's a supernatural type wrestling, right? It's something that is hard to even understand and fathom for us, but I gotta believe for Jacob, in his fear, when it's hard to separate the fear and the reality and everything else. This one thing, this wrestling, this thing that was happening was a manifestation of everything that was going on inside him. And so he goes and he starts to wrestle, and they wrestle together, and it says that they wrestle all night long until the sun comes up. I can't even. Have you ever tried to wrestle? Right? 3 minutes of wrestling will wear you out. Jacob is wrestling with this guy, and they're wrestling together. There's actually a lot going on here I'm going to explain in just a second as we scoot forward into this passage. But as they're wrestling together, the sun starts to come out, and the man says, "You have to let me go because the sun is coming out." And Jacob says, "I'm not going to let you go. Bless me, bless me." And as Jacob is fighting with him, he's grabbing hold of him, he's grabbing his leg, the man reaches out, and he just takes his hand and he touches him on the hip. Boom. And all of a sudden, the hip socket is just blasted and destroyed. Something tears inside his hip. We're not talking like he punched him. We're not talking he took it and ripped it out. He touched his hip and everything was changed. And Jacob, as he's sitting there and he's hurt and he's crippled, he reaches out and he says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." In this dark night, Jacob wrestled. And we see a second here what this all means in verse 27 and 28. "What is your name?" the man asked. And he replied, "Jacob." "Your name will no longer be Jacob," the man told him. "From now on you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won." This is an amazing moment. Jacob obviously knew that there was something supernatural about this moment as he is trying to get this man to bless him. And as he does, the man looks at him. He says, "What is your name?" He said, "My name is Jacob. Your name's no longer going to be Jacob. It's going to be called Israel, because you have wrestled with God and man, or fought with God and men and won." That word Israel means struggles with God. Israel means that he fought and he worked and he walked along. He struggled with God and with men, and he found victory. Let me let you a little bit on Jacob. I told you his story here a few minutes ago. Jacob, the word Jacob means heel grabber. All right? Heel grabber. You ever said somebody, "You're pulling my leg"? You know, somebody who lies to you. That's kind of the picture, but it's more than that. In ancient Middle Eastern idea here, the name Jacob, actually for him, sprung from the fact that when he was born right after his brother, and as his brother is being born, this hand shoots out and grabs hold of his brother, and it's Jacob holding onto his heel. So his parents thought, "That's a cool name. He's grabbing his heel. He's Jacobing. Let's just call him Jacob." The problem is, Jacob, in Middle Eastern understanding, is a term that you use for somebody who's a deceiver, somebody who's a trickster, somebody who is looking to take advantage of other people, someone who you can't trust. When I was in Oklahoma, we had multiple kids in the churches that I was in, and the couple churches that I was in, named Rowdy. The number of kids named Rowdy in Oklahoma is unbelievable. Let me tell you about every one of those kids named Rowdy. They were not docile, right? They were not soft-spoken. They were not calm. You know what they were? Rowdy. They were all rowdy, right? You give a kid an identity, he's going to live up to that identity. Jacob's identity from the moment he was born was an identity that was built on, you're going to be a deceiver, you're going to be a taker, you're going to have to fight for yourself. And Jacob spent his entire life deceiving his brother. If you read on between the passages we read last week and this week, he spends this life fighting along against his uncle, trying to take what he can from his uncle, trying to scratch and claw and get for himself because he doesn't really trust that anybody else is going to provide. But in this moment, I love this. This man, who we're going to see in a second, is a Christophany. This man looks at Jacob and says, "You're no longer going to be called heel grabber, deceiver, scratcher and clawer. You're going to be called Israel, the man who struggles and wins." Instead of being a deceiver, he is now a victor. God changes his identity. On the darkest night of Jacob's life, he held on to God with all that he had, and God changes his identity. What we see in this passage, what we really believe that this man is, that Jacob is wrestling with, what theologians really believe he is a Christophany, an appearance of Jesus before Jesus' first incarnation 2,000 years ago. We see this a few times in Scripture. One prominent time you can think of is when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you guys remember that story, are thrown into the fire, and there's a fourth man in there who the guard looks at and says, it looks like one of the sons of the gods in there with them. We believe that this same situation is what's happening right now because of what Jacob says next. See, Jacob holds on and he fights and he claws and he fights, and it says that in this darkest, scariest night of his life, he is holding on to God with all that he has. And this moment is the one that changes his life. And Jacob says to him in verse 29 this: "Please tell me your name." Jacob said. "Why do you want to know my name?" The man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there, and Jacob called the place Peniel, which means face of God. For he said, "I have seen the face of God, seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." The sun was rising as Jacob left Peniel, and he was limping because of the injury to his hip. There are moments in our lives that are transformative. The moments in our lives where God truly changes the way that we see the world. The funny thing is most of us don't know that that moment is coming, right? We don't realize that this is about to be that moment until that moment comes. Jacob in this night realizes as the sun comes up that I've just had that moment. He says, I understand now that I have just seen God face to face and I'm still alive. I'm still alive. I have wrestled with God. I have struggled. I have fought along with God. I'm here today. And God has changed me. Now, when Jacob does this, he understands that he's changed, but he's not the same. God, knowing what we know now, knowing that this is a Christophany, knowing that at that moment that he was done, man reached up and touched Jacob's hip. God reached up and touched Jacob's hip, and it just popped. It was out of place. We understand that he just as easily could have reached up and touched him in the chest, and that could have been the end. God was choosing not to take him. He was choosing not to destroy him. He was just changing him. There's I love this, and it's not biblical. I'm stepping away from the Bible this morning, but I see this in the Bible in the way that we live this out. C.S. Lewis says in the Chronicles of Narnia, when his Christ figure, Aslan the lion, as he's describing this lion, somebody says, so is the lion safe? And the response is, no, he's not safe, but he's good. I want to talk to you something about God. Following God is not safe. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be easier. It doesn't mean that everything is going to be nicer, and from this point forward, you're never going to have another struggle again. Jacob has this encounter with God, and as he's walking the next morning, you can imagine as he is walking along and his brother is about to show up, his brother comes and he walks up and he sees Jacob, and what's Jacob doing? Is Jacob standing there strong and ready to go? No, he is exhausted and he's tired, and as he walks up, he goes, because his hip is shot. That wasn't very nice of God. But I can guarantee you in this moment, Jacob is not dejected because his hip is shot. He is energized in a way that he never has been before because of that his identity is changed. Because he has made it through this darkest night of his life. And God has changed his identity. You see, Jacob left this night with a bad hip and a new name. And that changed who he was. Now I want to, with that story, I'll fill you guys in on the rest of it here. It's just an amazing thing. The reason that Esau actually was coming was not to kill Jacob. He was bringing 400 guys to protect him on the rest of his journey. You see, Esau had quite a change of heart over the last 20 years as well. Jacob never could have known that. He didn't know what God was doing inside Esau's heart. But when Esau shows up, he doesn't kill Jacob. He sets out to protect him. Wrestling with God. Walking with God. If you choose to live this out, it's going to change you. Wrestling with God has left me changed. I'm different today than I was before. Before I knew who it was that I was following, but it hasn't always been safe and it hasn't always been easy. Choosing to walk with God has put me in places where I've had to watch children die. Choosing to walk with God has put me in places where I've had to see the worst of the human condition as family members fight with each other, as family members hate each other. Choosing to walk with God has put me in a position where I've had to deal with my own family stuff and not just push it to the side. Choosing to walk with God and sometimes has been very painful. But I would never take it back. Because choosing to walk with God has allowed me to see that there is a promise that is greater than the simple junk that we deal with in these day-to-day moments. That promise is greater than the one that Jacob got. That promise is a promise of life, not just now, but forever, and the Holy Spirit living inside you as a guide. And that promise also for us carries a new name. So here's my bottom line. Those who seek God receive a new identity. I'd said when God does some work, he changes people's names, and there's a really cool thing. There's one time Jesus is talking to his friend Simon, and he says to Simon, Simon, I'm changing your name. You're no longer going to be called Simon. You're going to be called Peter. Peter, which means rock. You're going to be called the rock, and you are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell are not going to be able to stand against it. So I'm changing you. You are going to be the one. I'm changing your identity, and who you are now is going to be the start of what's going to be the church. The church is going to be this amazing beacon, this amazing outpouring of my body in this world. This church is going to change the world. The gates of hell are not going to be able to stand against the church. And he says this to this guy, Simon, who is impetuous and has a lack of self-control, doesn't always see things the right way or make the right decisions. But God chose to change his name and his identity. And I want to give you guys a little promise of what God's doing with us as well. At the very end of Scripture, in Revelation, we see something. It's one of, outside of the promise of salvation, this is my favorite promise that God makes for us. This is in Revelation chapter 2, verse 17. Anyone who has ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what he is saying to the churches. To everyone who is victorious, I will give some manna that has been hidden away in heaven, and I will give each one a white stone. And on that stone will be engraved a new name that no one understands except the one who receives it. I've spoken a little bit about this before, but I love this. If you overcome and don't quit, there is going to be a day that you are going to stand before Jesus, and Jesus is going to give you a white stone, and on that stone is going to be a name. And that name is going to be your name. But nobody else is going to understand that name but you and Jesus. Nobody else. You can hand it to your spouse, and it's not going to make sense to your spouse because Jesus knows you on the inside, and Jesus is going to say, this is my name for you, and it's going to make sense to you because he knows everything that you've been through. And he's going to give you that name. That's a promise of God. In the same way that Jacob, as he wrestled with God, he wrestles and he wrestles and he wrestles, and God says, I'm changing your name. I'm changing your identity. I know what they've called you. I know what everybody has called you. I know the identity that you've worn for yourself because you didn't know anything else, but I've got a new one for you. That's what God promises to do through Jesus for you. To change your identity. So I want to ask you to do some things today as we get ready to close here. If you have a journal, maybe write this right on the top of your journal on this next page so you can start thinking about this week. If not, maybe take a picture of it so you can think this. I want you to write these things down. Journal the ways that God has changed your identity as you have followed him. I want you to spend a few minutes just writing down the ways that you used to find value that you no longer find value, the things that you used to say about yourself that you no longer say about yourself. The reason I got punched in the face back in 1995 is part of my identity was I may not be the strongest guy in the room, but I was the guy that could put you and make you feel stupid with my words. And that's no longer me. God has changed that about me. My identity is different today because of Jesus. That is a powerful thing, right? It's a powerful thing to understand that. And I want to ask you to write down the things that you used to find your identity in, that if you're a follower of Jesus, you no longer do because you see in those moments the transformation of God. I'm going to tell you something. If you sat there and you write these things honestly, you're going to have a hard time having anybody around because you're going to be afraid for anybody to see it. But God knows those things, and he says, I got a white stone for you with a different name. I got a different name for you. That's the power of God and the transformation of God. then I want to ask you to pray. Pray for strength, for strength to be the person that seeks God's blessing. My favorite part of this story outside of the new name is the fact that Jacob just said, I'm seeking God. I'm seeking the blessing. I'm not going to quit until I have it. The people who are the most transformative in scriptures are the ones who just sit there and say, I'm not quitting. I'm seeking the blessing of God, and I'm not going to let anything get in the way. I wish I could say that that's always been a part of my identity. Even in the last week or month, there are times when I just throw my hands up and say, not today. I want to be like Jacob, who seeks the blessing. How do you cling to God? And then lastly, and this is a hands thing, but it's more just a thought thing. I want to ask you with your hands to ignore the deceiver when he tries to remind you of your old identity. So I asked you to write down the things that God has given up, moved you past. But the reality is, many of us still find ourselves saying, well, this is who I used to be, but it could easily be who I am right now. Satan tries to get us to do that. We don't have to go down those paths anymore. Ignore the deceiver when he tries to remind you of who you used to be. I shared here a couple weeks ago that one of my biggest fears about coming back to New Mexico was running into people that knew me before. It's actually happened. But I want to tell you something about the amazing way that God changes us. Running into those people, talking with those people, they no longer are stuck on the person that I was before in the way that I thought they would be. You know who was stuck on the person I was before? Me. Do we have faith to trust that God can change us? And then do we have faith to live it out? I want to pray. After that, John's going to come forward. If you'd like to pray with some people, I'll be in the back to pray with you too. So let's just pray for God to work on our identities, and then we're going to spend some time communion. So let me pray.